Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please rise as we welcome the procession inside the venue? Thank you so much. Thank you. You may be seated.
Good evening. I'm Kanchikan Rajaratnam. I'm the director of the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking here at Stellenbosch University. It is a school that was launched to build up interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary school, research, work with the faculties and other schools. We've done, some of the projects we've done include genomic surveillance. Some projects that are planned include quantum computing and policy innovation lab. As the director, there's no greater pleasure than celebrating the career of one of our own. And it is with this zeal of honor and pleasure that I welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Frank Tanser, both online and here in this room. An inaugural lecture is a special occasion where we celebrate the academic career and achievement, where the university recognizes the appointment and promotion of a full professor at this institution. Let me welcome you again, members of the university, staff and students alike, as well as from the larger community. Let me just call out some members individually. Let me welcome Professor Sibusiso Moyo, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies, Professor Elmi Muller, the Dean of Faculty of Medicine and Health Science, Professor Bertram Fielding, the Dean of Science, Professor Eugene Klutter, the former DVC of Research, Innovation and Postgraduate Studies, Professor Luis Warnick, the former Dean of Science, Professor Tulio de Oliveira, the Director of the Center for Epidemic Response and Innovation, Professor Francesco Petruccioni, the Interim Director of the National Institute of Theoretical and Computational Sciences, and Professor Tulani Makalanyani from Microbiology. Online, we also have other staff members here. Professor Hester Klopper, the DVC for Strategy, Global and Corporate Affairs, Professor Vikas van Niekerk, the Dean of Engineering, Professor Taran Young, the Executive Head of Global Health, Wolfgang Prezier, the Head of Division of Medical Virology, and Regan Johnson from the SRC Executive and a Senate member. It is with my great pleasure that I also welcome Timothy and Diana Tanser. Please can you put up your hand? The parents of Professor Frank Tanser. Welcome. Welcome to this inauguration. Additionally, we also have other members of Frank's family, Leonie Tanser. I don't see Leonie Tanser. Christopher, Anthony, and Olivia. Can you put up your hands as well? We have also friends and other friends from of Frank Tanser, Zeri Mayer, Anna Fati, Ben Brooks, Pauline and Bruce Alexander, as well as members of the School for Data Science and Computational Thinking, the Center for Epidemic Response and Innovation, and SACIMA, our colleagues of Frank Tanser. Without further ado, let me call upon Professor Almi Muller to give the introduction. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a pleasure to do the introduction for our colleague, Professor Frank Tanser, who is a wonderful epidemiologist who has worked his whole life in the South African epidemiology and infectious disease world, and who is focused on epidemiology that influenced critical public health issues, specifically in rural African communities. And you might wonder, why did he choose this career path? I was wondering about that. And then I realized that he grew up in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe, very close to Mozambique, and that he has got a strong rural health interest because he grew up in areas where these issues were very prevalent. But interestingly, he's done these walking safaris all his life through. Going on into the wildlife and encountering wild animals, to the point where they actually survived a very, very bad black rhino attack a few years ago. If you Google Frank Tanser, you will find that he's very prominent in the news for his survival of this issue, and also for Timothy, who I think was very badly injured by this. But it is, of course, shows you his interest in the world, in nature, in Africa, in wildlife, in communities, and probably that is one of the main reasons why he returned when he was in the UK for 5 years, coming back to Africa, working in Africa, and working in the rural health area again. I do think he's probably addicted to adrenaline, although he looks very calm, if you look at all these things he's done. And I do also know that he speaks fluently Zulu and Shona from where he has grown up. So it's a wonderful, well-rounded person that we are hearing something about tonight. But just saying something about his research as well. One of the important things is that his research impacts governmental policy in South Africa. ART programs in Africa were designed and implemented because of the work that Frank has done. And some of his prominent work was published very early in his career in the Journal of Science, where he showed the very valuable clinical intervention that nurses can do in decentralized HIV programs in rural areas and how that impacts on HIV transmission. He's been honored tremendously. He received many excellence awards, some of it that is very well known to us, like the South African MRC Gold Medal that he received, and the Royal Geographical Society who awarded him the Back Medal. And we are very privileged at Stellenbosch University when Frank joined us in 2023 as a Director of Population Health and Innovation at SERI. Currently working on 2 very prestigious R1 grants from the NIH, which is once again doing interesting research in the HIV field, specifically focusing on HIV prevention strategies, which will probably influence once again South African and international policy makers. And then also a very interesting topic, harnessing male peer networks to enhance engagement with HIV prevention. And we know that it is very, very difficult for a lot of men to take the necessary precautions in rural areas to prevent HIV. And we hope that this research grant will also provide very interesting results, specifically on pre-exposure prophylaxis. So with this type of interdisciplinary work that Frank is bringing to Stellenbosch University, working with other collaborators in Africa, other collaborators internationally in Europe and elsewhere. He's bringing a very important perspective to the university, and we are very privileged to have him as part of our staff and for him to do his inaugural lecture tonight. It is a real honor to introduce him. Welcome, Frank, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Prof. Muller, and thank you, Prof. Kanchu, for that kind introduction. Good evening, colleagues, friends, family. It's a great honor and a privilege for me to be able to give this presentation. And I've titled my talk, The Rise and Fall of South Africa's HIV Epidemic, a Personal Perspective. And what I want to do is to speak about the work that I've been doing largely in HIV over the last 25 years or so, but also weave in some personal narrative about my journey along the way. So I've structured my talk like this. I'm going to give a little bit of background, then speak about the early years, and then talk about the who, what, where of HIV epidemiology, and then move on to the fall. Firstly, up front, I want to acknowledge my lovely wife and family who've stood by me throughout this career. It's been wonderful to always have them at my side. It wouldn't have been possible without them, so thank you. I wanted to give a little bit of background about myself before moving into the epidemiology. So I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, as Prof. Muller mentioned. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist with a keen interest in the space-time evolution of infectious diseases, both with a view to kind of understand the epidemiology, but also use that understanding to kind of intervene and design more effective interventions. I started off my undergraduate career at Rhodes, and actually started off doing geology and geography. Then did a master's in hydrology. And at that time, I was introduced to geographical information systems and remote sensing. And that is what I then applied throughout my career at Health. I then moved across and did a PhD in public health at the University of Natal, now of course University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then finally did an MSc in epidemiology at Imperial College London because I felt I needed that training. So I'll talk a little bit more about that slightly bizarre career trajectory as we go along, and hopefully it'll become clear how that all happened. I think what's really interesting to me is how often when someone talks about their career, it sounds like they made a series of kind of logical, strategic decisions to get to where they got to, but actually serendipity and chance meeting of kind of inspiring individuals can often change the course of a career. And that's really what happened to me. As Almi mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe, which is absolutely amazing. And I'm delighted now to have a project in that same area looking at pre-exposure prophylaxis among men. And I'll come back to that later in my talk. Rhodes didn't only give me my initial degrees. I also met my wife there, and I think we were the first in our cohort to get married. So we got married at the age of 23, took everyone by surprise. None of our friends really knew how to behave at a wedding or what to wear or anything. And we've just celebrated our 29th, so going for 30 next year. Almi mentioned, I've now been nearly killed by 3 of the big 5. But the rhino attack was the one that was particularly severe in the Shishlui-Umfolozi Reserve. And if you want to find out what it's like to be on the long horn of a rhino, then go and speak to my father after the presentation, because he was gored and luckily came back stronger than ever. But I love the bush, and I love going into those wilderness areas. So that's a little bit of a sort of whirlwind background to myself. And then I now want to speak about my academic journey. And I want to do this in honoring 4 men who really mentored me and taught me what science was all about And it's been a great privilege to have worked with these remarkable men over the course of my career. And they really taught me, a lot about science when I was first starting out. The first is Tony Palmer at Rhodes University, who worked for the Agricultural Research Council. Tony is a rangeland scientist and first introduced me to satellite imagery and use of satellite imagery for kind of land management purposes. And together from my master's, we published a couple of papers in this area, kind of utilizing remotely sensed data to make decisions on rangeland management. And the fact that one could actually use data collected hundreds of kilometers above the Earth and use it to make some kind of inference about management of a small patch of rangeland, probably smaller than this room, was to me quite fascinating. And so I was instantly kind of attracted to this field. David Lasser and Brian Sharp, both now sadly passed away, were responsible for easing me into health research. I just completed my MSc at Rhodes, and my wife and I were going to go back to Zimbabwe. We had packed our container, we had sent it off, and kind of got an interview at the 11th hour at the Medical Research Council. Flew to Durban, met with David Lasser, was kind of so inspired by the man that I decided, and they offered me a job at the MRC, in the malaria program. Was kind of so inspired that talked it over with my wife, and we said, you know what, it's a 6-month contract. We'll stay for 6 months and then see how it goes. And then, of course, 6 months turned into 24 years. I stayed in that field and found my niche, as it were. And Brian Sharp also was an entomologist, old school entomologist, but a very skilled leader, and taught me a lot about sort of man management and entomology. And so I really kind of honor those two men. And David Lasser, together with Brian Sharp, we published this paper in The Lancet looking at the potential impact of climate change on malaria transmission. And David Lasser had conceived this project called the Mapping Malaria Risk in Africa project, which took about 10,000 parasite surveys throughout Africa and combined it into a single database, geolocated them. For the first time that had ever been done. Some of these surveys were kind of sitting in boxes as footstools, sort of thing. And we then used that data to build a malaria model and look at what the malaria distribution might look like under different scenarios of climate change. So stepping it forward to 2100. So if you look at the top map on the top left, there's kind of what malaria looked like, the current distribution. And then the next 3 maps step it forward to 2100 under various degrees of climate change. And basically what we showed is that there was surprisingly little latitudinal change in the distribution of malaria, but a lot of altitudinal change, so moving into the altitudes which had never been seen before, sort of so-called highland malaria. And this paper, we had quite a large impact. David Wilkinson was the superintendent of the Hlabisa Hospital, which is where I helped set up the HIV surveillance with a team. And he was, as well as being superintendent, he was kind of a prolific scientist. He used to have a graph on his wall of the number of papers he published per year, and it was generally about 50 per year, so about 1 a week. But he used to do almost all the analysis and all the writing. So he was just a highly prolific individual. He taught me what science is all about kind of making inference from observational data. So I was privileged to work with these men. And together we published papers particularly around tuberculosis and the move towards a directly observed treatment strategy, moving out of the hospital into the community, and what the implications of that were, and also some around HIV as well. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a background to myself and my career. I want to speak now about the early years of HIV research. But before I do that, I just want to quickly take some time to orientate the audience to HIV. So this is the HIV prevalence in 2022, 38 million people globally living with HIV, 70% in sub-Saharan Africa, And you can see that within sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa is the region with the highest number of HIV cases. And within Southern Africa, South Africa has the largest number of people infected with HIV, 7.8 million people. And within South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal is the province with the highest prevalence of HIV. So most cases in KwaZulu-Natal, which is where this work that I'm going to present took place. So we're really talking about the epicenter of the epicenter. And people often forget that South Africa was well on its way to the health transition when HIV hit. So that is kind of moving from dominantly infectious disease causing the deaths to dominantly non-infectious disease. And what you see in this graph here, if you look at the top left, is the blue bars are those deaths that are caused by non-communicable diseases. So that was in 1997. Red is HIV and TB, green is injury, and purple are other infectious diseases. And so you can see the pattern of deaths was kind of dominated by non-communicable diseases. As we hit 2000, HIV is coming into the picture. 2005, HIV completely dominates the picture, so responsible for almost a large proportion of the deaths. And what is particularly severe about HIV is that it hits the most productive members of society, so it's the young adults supporting families, so it not only impacts the individuals themselves, but also the families who are dependent on them. And then you can see the last graph there, as ALVs were starting to kick in, the HIV deaths went down. But this next graph shows how HIV really ripped through the country. So this is antenatal data. And you can see that in 97, I think it is difficult to see on the screen here, prevalence is about 0.7%, so just coming in. And then by 2004 or so, it's already 30%. This is amongst antenatal women. So it really just ripped through the country. Another theme that I'll come back to throughout the talk is the fact that HIV is very heterogeneous. It's not homogeneous by geography, it's not homogeneous by gender, it's not homogeneous by age, it's not homogeneous by socioeconomic group. It tends to affect certain groups more than others. And particularly with regard to geographic heterogeneity, here you see KwaZulu-Natal, about 40% prevalence. This was in 2012. Western Cape, about 16%. So even within South Africa, there's already this massive difference. And this is something that just, our data has shown not only did that not disappear, but it actually kind of got more and more intense over time. So the work that I'm largely going to be speaking on took place, as I said, in northern KwaZulu-Natal, quite close to the border with Swaziland or Eswatini. And the map on the right there shows where we set up this HIV surveillance. So in that grey area that you see there, there are about 100,000 people living. Every one of those 100,000 people through this HIV surveillance was visited annually and tested for HIV. So we have field workers going around knocking door to door, knocking on doors, testing people for HIV. And the value of that is it's population-based, so it's not biased by people who choose to go to clinic. It's actually in the population. And so one can get a very sensitive, it keeps a very sensitive finger on the pulse of the epidemic. And from that, you can really get a sense of where the epidemic is headed. And this became one of the largest HIV cohorts in the world. And those red crosses that you see there are the clinics where ART was eventually delivered. This is a very impoverished rural population, so second most deprived district in the country, Mkhanyakude. But there are pockets of urban and peri-urban populations, which I'll speak about as well, because those have dramatically different epidemic profiles. Now, I couldn't resist showing this picture, which is the very first meeting of what was to become the Africa Center for Health and Population Studies, and now is the Africa Health Research Institute. And there I am on the bottom left. I was a master's student here and didn't even have my PhD. Colleagues say I look about 6 years old in that picture. Of course, I think I look exactly the same today. But what was interesting is that, this was kind of a motley crew of intrepid individuals. I think it's fair to say that none of us really had a clue what we were doing. We kind of had to learn on the job and learn as we went along. But the thinking around the HIV epidemic was very different then. And the thinking was that, and this was based mainly on mathematical models, was that the epidemic is going to explode, it's going to go everywhere, it's going to become ubiquitous, and so kind of spatial heterogeneity is going to disappear. And therefore, any talk about kind of targeting specific communities was considered complete anathema, because everyone knew it was going to go everywhere. But what our data eventually showed is that not only did that heterogeneity not disappear, but actually got worse over time. And I'll show some figures to that extent. And that heterogeneity, I believe, represents a really good opportunity for targeted interventions to kind of target the most vulnerable populations. This was the very first group of field workers. This amazing group of young women mapped 26,000 bounded structural homesteads, Zulu homesteads across the area, over a distance of 1,400 square kilometers. So they went with GPSs, knocking door to door, walking around. Many of them have stayed on at the center, so it's been great to see them kind of rise through the ranks. One became a traffic cop and pulled me over for speeding one day near Mpangeni. And let's just say it was a particularly joyous reunion on my side when I realized I wasn't going to get fined. One became a high-ranking official in the public health in the country. But tragically, 4 of the young women in this picture actually succumbed to the very virus they were helping us study. So really underlining the type of environment in which we were working. This graph kind of shows each of those homesteads mapped. In those days when the GPS technology was very new, and it used to have an intentional random error introduced by the US military, so you couldn't use it to navigate like you do now. The positions used to bounce all over the place. And the only way you could get a proper position was actually to have a single GPS unit at a known location and then measure how much it changed second on second and then differentially correct those positions. So we had to do that for all 26,000 of those homesteads. Here was the very first office where we set up 4 of us behind the fuel pumps in Matuba, the locals say Matuba twice. So on to some of the results. The very first HIV survey conducted in 2003 in that grey area, in the population amongst the 100,000, all of the adults, showed some of the highest population-based HIV prevalence rates ever shown worldwide, ever documented. So in the age group 25 to 29, amongst females, it was more than 50%, then 30% in 20 to 24-year-olds. And what's really striking from this figure is the incredible gender differential. So if you look at 20 to 24-year-olds, it's about 8% prevalence in men, about 30% in females. And then after age 30 to 34, it's much more, there's much more parity. But this kind of illustrates one of the greatest challenges that it's always been for HIV is these young females and how to prevent them becoming infected. And I'll show some data later as to how that's looking now. It was also a very difficult time to be in HIV because we had the whole Mbeki denial era. So Thabo Mbeki, then president, used to go surfing the web at night and kind of fell on some conspiracy theories that HIV didn't cause AIDS. And because of that, it delayed rolling out antiretroviral therapy. And it was only when civil action groups actually took him to court to roll out Nevirapine to pregnant women, were the government forced to roll out ARVs. And it's been conservatively estimated that that cost 300,000 completely avoidable deaths, just that kind of dithering and messing around. So it was a very dark chapter in South Africa's history, but thankfully we've moved on, and we've moved on significantly from that. And this cartoon by Jonathan Shapiro, I think, kind of sums it up. Mbeki basically convened a quack panel to tell him whether HIV caused AIDS, and obviously, South Africa to some extent became the laughing stock of the world. But as I say, we've moved on from that very dramatically. And these were some of the scenes of the day. So you can imagine relations with the Department of Health were incredibly strained, and there was nothing that you could actually do for people, other than treat for STIs. And so funeral parlors were just absolutely booming, but thankfully then the ARTs kicked in. So I've spoken about, given my background, spoken about the early years, now talk about the who, what, where of HIV epidemiology. So firstly, who are the vulnerable groups? The one group that has always been exceptionally vulnerable are migrants. So in South Africa, the exceptionally high rates of internal migration are rooted in apartheid-era policies, which are aimed at ensuring the supply of rural African male labourers to the mines, particularly around Johannesburg. And presently, high rates of circular migration have continued for both men and women. And from the outset, migration and HIV have been closely intertwined. So one of the reasons that it was believed that HIV spread so fast in South Africa is because men were kind of going to the mines, leaving their partners in rural areas, going to the mines, having interactions with sex workers, living in terrible conditions, coming back and infecting their rural partners. And that's one of the reasons it was believed that it took off so rapidly. And that interconnection has continued. So we're doing a lot of work in migrants, which I won't have time to do today, but it is still considered a vulnerable group. And as the epidemic contracts, what we expect to see is those groups will be disproportionately even more important, because HIV will contract into those more vulnerable groups. And so it's really important that we find ways of dealing with that. The other thing that I've alluded to is young females. So these graphs show HIV incidence. So that is the number of new infections per population that is occurring. So the graph on the left there for females, incidence peaks at 8 new infections per 100 person years. So that means you take 100 HIV negative females, age 24, follow them for a year. By the end of that year, 8 will be infected. And if you think of those rates year on year on year, you realize why you build up to some quite high numbers very quickly. And males much later and much less, but nevertheless still significant. So that has still been one of the greatest challenges, is addressing these high rates of new infections amongst young females. And if you add up those rates, you get to an 80% lifetime risk of acquiring HIV at that stage amongst young females. So a young girl entering adolescence at that stage, exposed to a lifetime of those risks, 80%. So really, we are really dealing with an epidemic of staggering proportions. So those are the two really vulnerable groups. Second, what? So what is driving it, and what can you do about it? So again, I fall back to the learned pen of Jonathan Shapiro. But there's this disconnect between knowledge of AIDS and behavior change. So knowledge of HIV or AIDS was believed to be quite good, and yet didn't translate into much behavior change at that stage, pre-ART. And one of the sort of dominant theories at the time was this theory of multiple concurrent partners. And that said that the reason it took off in Africa was not because in Africa people had more partners over time, but they had more concurrent partners, so more long-term partnerships with multiple partners over time. And that was believed to kind of link up the sexual networks, and I'll explain a little bit about that more. And it almost became a sort of dogma that all one had to do was to reduce these concurrent sexual partners. And so if you look at the last line in this bit from Soul City, in direct response to these findings, the Soul City Regional Program is embarking on a 3-year HIV prevention campaign which aims to reduce new infections in the region by focusing on reducing multiple concurrent partnerships. And it had almost become accepted wisdom. And then a couple of papers started to come out and say, but hang on, where's the evidence? Does this actually explain it? And they queried the assumptions of the mathematics. They also queried like the evidential base, where is the evidence? And this quote from that paper, promoters of the concurrency hypothesis have failed to establish that concurrency is unusually prevalent in Africa, or that the kinds of concurrent partnerships found in Africa produce more rapid spread of HIV than other forms of sexual behavior. And this kind of took the HIV world by storm somewhat, because no one had really queried these things before. So we thought, well, there's a really good opportunity here, because what we can do is to utilize the high-quality epidemiological data and the high-quality geographical data and kind of really test this hypothesis. And for reasons that I won't go into in detail, it's not a hypothesis about individual level risk. So having more concurrent sexual partners versus having the same number of partners, same number of unprotected sexual acts doesn't increase your risk. But what it supposedly did was to link up these networks over time and space and facilitate more rapid spread across the population. So it's a risk factor for transmission rather than acquisition. So what we did is to kind of use the high quality geographical data, high quality epidemiological data to map, so lifetime partners on the left and concurrency prevalence, so proportion of people reporting concurrent sexual partners on the right. And then essentially do some statistical models and look at whether, so this graph shows whether communities with high numbers of lifetime partners had a higher HIV incidence, had a higher rate of new infections. And as you would expect, high numbers of lifetime partners, immediately there's a relationship. But what we saw with concurrent sexual partners is virtually no relationship, or no relationship at all. And we did multiple statistical models, multiple things that I won't go into. But what it showed is that concurrency is a little bit of a sideshow in this epidemic context. So it may well have been important in the beginning. But the kind of messaging was very confused. It was like, you can have partners, just don't have them at the same time. And there was kind of this fixation about overlapping partnerships. And so our conclusion there was we find no evidence to suggest that concurrent partnerships are an important driver of HIV incidence in these typical populations. Our findings suggest that in similar settings, there's need for straightforward, unambiguous messages aimed at reductions of multiple partnerships, irrespective of whether those partnerships overlap in time. And it's one of the hardest things to do in science to publish a null finding. And so I think this had to go through 6 revisions at the Lancet. But eventually we did, and this had quite a big impact on policy as well. So also in terms of the what can you do about it? And the global scale-up of ART is one of the largest public health interventions ever undertaken. So I think prior to COVID vaccination, it was the largest public health intervention ever taken. And South Africa has the largest number of people with ART in the world. So 5.7 million people on ART in South Africa in 2022. Which is actually fantastic when you think back to the Thabo and Becky days. We've come a long way. And in response to kind of looking to get more people onto treatment, UNAIDS released what were initially the 90-90-90 targets, which became the 95-95-95 targets. And that was all about getting, of those that are infected, 95% should know their status. Of those who know their status, 95% of those should be on treatment. Of those on treatment, 95% should be virally suppressed. And that was the target. And we thought, again, there's a really good opportunity here because we can look at a real population laboratory at what the impact is at a population level of moving towards those targets. And firstly, look at mortality, so adult life expectancy. And the dotted line there in 2004 represents when ART was rolled out. And you can see that the adult life expectancy was 49 years of age in our population, which is quite staggering in the 21st century. And every year post-rollout had 1 year of life gained across the entire population. So also one of the largest kind of public health impacts ever documented. So this, and then by 2012, it was already over 60 years of age. So from mortality, and life expectancy, it was dramatic and sudden. Then there was this amazing trial, HPTN 052 trial, which showed that in a serodiscordant couple, so where one is positive, one is negative, if you give the positive person ARTs, the chance of them on transmitting to the negative partner is virtually zero, 96% reduction. And before this, there'd kind of been two camps. You were either in the treatment camp or you were in the prevention camp. And I sat in many meetings where people seriously argued that we should just let the existing cohort die and focus all the money on prevention, and likewise other people sitting in the prevention camp. And it was driven by the high cost of ART. And basically, as soon as this trial showed its results, there was no longer treatment and prevention, there was treatment as prevention. If you treated, you got a preventative effect. So quickly people modeled, like, what if we gave a large proportion of the population ARTs? And this model, Greenwich et al., basically showed that you could eliminate the epidemic. And so very quickly, and of course, this trial was done in perfect conditions where everyone is monitored and the pills are given at the right time. But then the question then becomes, to what extent does this work in like a real-life African setting with an imperfect healthcare, issues of drug supply, issues of non-adherence? And so immediately all of these trials were launched to kind of test this hypothesis, one of which the ANRS trial there took place at our site. And we thought, again, there's a real opportunity here. Can we kind of utilize geography? Can we utilize the space-time evolution, how ART rolled out to kind of test this hypothesis, this treatment as prevention hypothesis? And this is the work that we published in Science. So this series of maps shows the rollout of ART, the scale-up. So if it's green, less than 10% of the population are on ART. If it's orange, more than 40%. From 2004, top left, to 2011, bottom right. So you can see that scale up. So what we did is essentially to compare, using that as a space and time varying covariate. So the exposure that every person gets is based on where they are and what time they were, and when they were there. And basically we compared communities with very high coverage of ART against communities with very low coverage of ART and looked at what the risk would be to an HIV-negative individual living in those communities and compared that. And this is what we published in Science. And basically showed very convincingly that living in a community where 40 to 50% around you are taking ARTs, compared to a community where only 10% of people are, was a reduction in risk of 38%. So 38% less risk of acquiring HIV. And these results were published 4 years before the trials were due to come out, because the trials had to collect all this data starting from scratch, whereas we were in this position. So it was a real privilege to be able to kind of have this data, to be able to impact on policy, and received sort of write-ups in Science, Nature, and UNAIDS. UNAIDS welcomes further evidence of the positive impact of antiretroviral therapy on preventing HIV infections. But first time it could be shown in a rural African community that this could actually work, it could actually reverse the epidemic. I've alluded to this already, but again, the young female problem is one of the most pervasive problems in HIV, and it's because these young men, so the graph on the left is female incidence, graph on the right is male viral loads. That's the amount of virus in the men. And essentially what it shows is these young men have high levels of virus because they're not accessing treatment. And so to reduce HIV incidence in young females, it's really essential that we find ways of getting these young men onto treatment. And we've been doing a lot of work in this area. But I'll just show you one slide. So this is a cluster randomized trial we're now conducting in KwaZulu-Natal. And we're giving a number of interventions to try get men to firstly test and then secondly link to HIV care. So the blue line on each of these graphs, you've got men on the left, females on the women on the right. The blue line shows the intervention groups. Those who received an intervention. The intervention was basically a 50 Rand voucher that you could redeem at a local supermarket. And so for females, give them 50 Rand and immediately increase their uptake, and they went to clinic. More of them went to clinic. With men, it made absolutely no difference. So it is a very difficult nut to crack. Very difficult. And a lot of the work in Zim that we're doing is all around men and finding innovative ways of getting them to get to care. Okay, so I've covered the who and what. Now I want to speak a little bit about the where. And again, coming from my background from GIS, remote sensing, this is where I'm particularly sort of passionate about. I mentioned the extraordinary heterogeneity in HIV outcomes. So this is HIV incidence. And the red here represents greater than 4 new infections per 100 person years. The dark blue represents less than 2. And those ellipses that you see there are formal clusters of infections. So those are much higher than expected number of HIV infections, new infections. And those are in the peri-urban communities that I mentioned earlier. So these are the peri-urban communities along the national road, high numbers of lifetime partners, high levels of mobility, all of the risk factors kind of coming together. But the really intriguing question then becomes, okay, so we found this substantial heterogeneity, this high-risk communities. Is there a possibility that those communities are playing a disproportionate role in kind of driving the whole epidemic? Are they, because populations are going through and kind of having interactions, sexual interactions with people in those communities, could they be seeding epidemics elsewhere? And if so, is there a sort of basis for targeting those vulnerable communities? And this is something you could test with phylogenetics, the work that I did with Tulio. And so this map on the right represents, each line represents a linked infection. So 2 individuals linked by the genetics of the virus. These are pole sequences. And what you can see is that 75% of all linked infections involve those hotspot communities. So essentially giving some impetus to our earlier hypothesis that actually if you targeted these vulnerable communities, you could really have a disproportionate impact. And this is something we published in PLOS Global Health. But what's been great about this work is we were able to substantially impact in policy. So after this and other findings that were coming out, PEPFAR changed their strategic plan. The Global Fund's new funding model was all about geographical prioritization. UNA has released a report saying location, location, location. So again, and it's something that I think was probably not expected at the outset of the HIV epidemic. So now I want to change tack a little bit. I kind of fitted this into the where, because where was I when I was doing some of this work? And in 2019, I was headhunted to launch a new institute in the UK that Prof. Muller alluded to, the Lincoln International Institute for Rural Health, based at the University of Lincoln. And this is the Lincoln Cathedral, which is actually the tallest, was the tallest building in the world for 237 years. So it actually took over from the pyramids of Giza when it was built. And it was 160 meters high, but it was the spire. It had this amazing spire that made it 160 meters high. And that collapsed in the 1500s, so then it lost its place. But it's an amazing city. Very historical. It's one of the major seats of power, historically, 500 years ago, major seats of power because of the wool trade that took place there. So I was recruited to set up this institute. It was very successful. In our first year, we got £1 million from something called the Wolfson Foundation, which is pretty much unheard of for the first year. But I found that I couldn't do the global health work that I really wanted to do. And my soul yearned to be back in Africa. So even though we kind of had this, it was going well, the institute was successful, I thought I really feel that I can make most difference in Africa. And this was some of the picture that I've taken doing field work in northern KwaZulu-Natal. And about that time, I had like Tulio whispering in my ear, come. Telling me how great Stellenbosch was, and we have a long relationship going back many years, worked together at KZN for many years. We're both profs there. I've been involved, I still have an honorary appointment there, so I've been involved with UKZN more than 25 years actually. But we worked together there very well, but I always joke with Tulio that whilst he provided the good looks, I was the brains of the partnership. But of course, it wasn't like that. We worked together very well. And so I came and I had a look, and I loved what I saw, and I was very excited about SERI and the work that Tulio was doing, and invited me to lead the Population Health Innovation Program. So this was the first day of my new job, which was just over a year and a bit ago. And I must say, it's just so nice to be back in civilization. So, so thank you, Tulio, and thank you to Stellenbosch. Yeah, I've really enjoyed my time, and there's lots to come. Also, another exciting development was I was asked to lead SACIMA from November last year, South African Centre for Epidemiological Modelling and Analysis, which I'm really excited about. Been working with amazing colleagues there, bringing that into the population health innovation within SERI, and so we just see so many synergies, and lots to come with that chapter as well. Okay, so back to sort of the structure of my talk. Finally, the fall, question mark. So the good news is that the HIV incidence landscape is really shifting. We've started to see these declines amongst both males and females. Started off in the men, followed by the females. We published this some time ago. I think this was 2017 or so, 2018. And then some very recent data, really just presented a few months ago at one of the conferences, not yet published. This is part of one of the R01s that I do work with, that I lead in KwaZulu-Natal. And what you can see that the decline in female incidence, which is the green line, the rate of decline is outstripping that of men, so really starting to fall off a cliff, which is really good news. Something we kind of thought we wouldn't see because it's a seemingly intractable problem. And so there really is impetus now to start to drive this towards elimination. But that's going to involve getting the men onto treatment. So I want to kind of end with a few, just a couple of slides. One, the work in Manicaland, the imperative trial. Very exciting cohort there. Lots of work around engaging men, innovative ways of engaging men. And with the Population Health Innovation Program, which is one that I lead within SERI, the program aims to use precision public health to design test interventions to improve population health in Africa. So to improve population health, we need population bases to test our things. And so the base at KwaZulu-Natal and Manicaland are kind of population bases, but then with the work at SERI with SACIMA, there's lots of opportunities for synergies and cross-fertilization and making the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So we're really excited about that, and that's what we'll be taking forward. So in conclusion, to borrow a line from The Economist, is this the end of AIDS? There's potentially yes, but I would just read this. So over the last 2 years, multiple overlapping crises have rocked the world, have had a devastating impact on people living with HIV. The new data revealed in this report are frightening. Progress has been faltering, resources have been shrinking, and inequality has been widening. Insufficient investment and action are putting all of us in danger. We face millions of AIDS-related deaths and millions of new HIV infections if we continue on our current trajectory. So I think there is a real danger of complacency creeping in. People do think that HIV is a problem solved. But this is the time that we must not take our foot off the throat of the epidemic. This is the time to push even harder. Okay, so final slide. In conclusion, although incidence has decreased dramatically, in my view, the talk of AIDS as a public health threat is a bit premature. The rate of new infections in this setting, meaning KwaZulu-Natal, is still 10 times greater than the target set for elimination. And there's been some disruption to medical supplies during COVID and other interruptions. Driving the epidemic towards elimination will require further increase in the coverage of antiretroviral therapy and the deployment of multiple prevention modalities tailored to suit and reach the most vulnerable groups, some of which we're testing in our sites. So some acknowledgements, there's like thousands of people I could acknowledge. I want to acknowledge these and the funders. I also want to dedicate this to my family, but also the original bunch of field workers that made a lot of this possible. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. I need to give you the certificate at this stage, just to say congratulations, and then I'll just make a few remarks. So thank you so much for the excellent lecture which you've given us today. And yeah, so thank you to the family, everybody's here. I know your mom, she was very excited, so she must be so proud of you. Yeah, so just to say thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm trying to find where I'm supposed to be. All right, so just to say thank you so much again for sharing with us on today's lecture, which is on the rise and fall of South Africa's HIV epidemic, a personal perspective. So your insights into the trajectory of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, coupled with your personal experiences, have provided a profound understanding of the challenges and triumphs, of course, in the fight against HIV. And you have shown, of course, in your last remarks that we shouldn't be complacent, but try to continue on the trajectory that we've had to make sure that we come to, hopefully, one day, zero count of HIV-infected people. So your lecture not only sheds light on the complexities of the epidemic, but also has inspired, of course, reflection of the resilience of the communities that you've worked with, and the importance of personal narratives in shaping public health interventions. I think on the issue of men, what I took away is that it's still a challenge of us, and of course, and I'm glad that at least one of the grants that I got makes sure that we continue working with the men in ensuring that we reduce the impact on women. Usually in these in sub-Saharan Africa, you see that many women get infected, the younger girls get infected, and this has an impact generally also on the economy, especially if you look at the impact in terms of trying to run a country where most of the people are infected. I mean, there's an economic impact, of course, in the cost and so forth. So I think I would like to encourage the other people who are doing research to also look at the economic impact of some of these interventions and what that means. So I like the fact that you also mentioned the link between climate change and health, and I know that I have a School for Climate Studies as well, and I think that link also gives us a potential for other areas that we can look at in going forward. So it was interesting to also say that I think you talked about the vulnerable communities, the issue around migrants, and there's a lot of debate now about migration, and especially I think in sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa in particular, and what that means, of course, in terms of the economy, but also in terms of health and the impact of health on immigrants and how that also impacts the locals as well. So the 5.7 million on ART burden of disease is a very high sort of number of people infected. So, but I think for us, we have to also look at what it means for public health policy going forward. So on behalf of the Stellenbosch University Rectorate, we thank you for your significant contributions to HIV research at Stellenbosch University. And of course, the South African landscape and the global landscape as well. You have demonstrated the span of your work that deals with various aspects of HIV prevention, treatment, management, and also the impact on policies, including areas that you have highlighted in epidemiology, your work, which also involves clinical trials and public health interventions. Your contributions have advanced our understanding, especially those working in your area as well, in terms of HIV transmission dynamics, the development of ARVs as well, strategies for prevention, and the socioeconomic impacts of the epidemic itself. So your research plays a crucial role in informing policies, programs aimed at combating HIV in South Africa and beyond. So according to, just for those who may not know, according to the Google Scholar profile, Professor Frank Tanser has contributed well, in terms of citations, at 40,289 citations to date, and then also with an H index of about 68. It might not matter to many, but I don't know if your family maybe might think, well, so what does that mean? Anyway, but it just means he has a very high profile. So for the university, this makes us proud because it's one of the indicators that are also used for ranking universities. So we're always interested in looking at them. Yes, in the top 5, yes, we know that. So that is great. So congratulations. And I think we should clap for him because in this group, I can ask guys, I know that there are some young academics who are here. How many of you have reached, how many of you are under 45 years old in the group? I think some people are just raising their under 45, yeah? How many of you have reached 1,000 citations yet? The under 45s? Not yet? Oh yeah, there's Tulani, yes, but Tulani, your lecture is soon as well. So thank you so much. We just want to thank you for that. And then also I want to thank, so I think I should thank you for that, but without repeating your lecture because there's a lot to take away. Just to also say that, of course, I would like to thank then our colleagues who made sure that today was successful. I know we have a vote of thanks, but I need to acknowledge the Dean of Health Sciences, Professor Muller, the school director, also who's present, Professor Kanshu Rajaratnam. And then we have a new Dean of Science, the new Dean of Science. It's important to mention this because for us, SACIMA is important. You mentioned one of the roles that Frank has to play is to also lead SACIMA into the new era as well. So our new Dean of Science, Professor Bertram Fielding, who's with us. Professor Eugene Kluter, who used to be the former DV research, and I took over from him. So it's very nice to see yourself in the past. Like that's how I looked like, Eugene. And then Professor Louise Vanik, who used to be, where's Professor Louise? So she was the former Dean of Science, but yeah, also very supportive. So thank you so much, for making it possible and creating an enabling environment for Frank. And then, of course, Professor Tulio Vera, who was mentioned as well, for convincing Frank to come. I hope that we are what you thought we were supposed to be, a nice environment, and helping you to also move forward. Professor Francesco Petrocini is the incoming director for the National Institute for Theoretical and Computational Sciences, which is key for us because one of the things we say is that we produce a lot of data in some of the health sciences fields, and we need methods of how to deal with this data. So we are so excited to make sure that we improve the collaboration between the School for Data Science, the computational people, together with the health sciences scientists as well. And then, of course, Professor Tulani Makalanian is with us as well, who's going to have the inaugural lecture next, I think, next in the schedule, in October, sorry. And I know one of the things I mentioned is that, so Tulani joined us from University of Pretoria, so we are glad also that you are now part of the SU family, and I hope it was what you hoped for. And I know that there is Precious. Is Precious in here as well? Precious is a former Fulbright scholar who's just joined us as a postdoc as well from Durban University of Technology. But so we hope that you also, become part of the family. So just a special welcome. So a special thank you to the family once again, your whole family, your parents, and I think your daughter, sons, future daughter-in-law, sorry, you told me about the future daughter-in-law, to be soon. I want to wish you the best in advance, hey? Yeah. Was I wrong? Future daughter-in-law, are you the future? I'm the girlfriend. The girlfriend, oh. Sorry, so I hate future daughter-in-law. I'm sorry about that. But it's a blessing, isn't it? Yeah, and I'm sure it's a good blessing. I saw the first picture Frank showed, so in my head I'd already concluded the future. Sorry about that, but thank you so much, everybody. And then, best wishes once again from myself. Can I then ask for the vote of thanks from Professor Kanshu Rajaratnam to join us? Thank you.
Frank, thanks for your excellent talk and casting your dice with us here at Stellenbosch University. Frank's work is a great example of bringing together different fields to solve a grand challenge faced by South Africa. And we are certainly lucky to have you here. It is also an example of the kind of quality of science that happens in South Africa. So, and here at Stellenbosch University. So we are highly privileged. What is left for me is to I've thanked Frank. Thank you for coming here. Let me also thank the many people who made this possible. Our faculty partner, Mambele Kosa, I don't know where she is. CCMD marketing team, Amira Brown, Hiola Bergman, Cindy Arance. CCMD Corporate Communication Team, Candice Keating, Justin Alberts, Dr. Alec Basson, Renee Jean van der Berg, Ilse Hobler, Sonika Lambert, the registrars, RC, and collaborators, Jonathan Dale Blackenberg, who was on email with me every day. Thank you, Jonathan. Henrian Swanapool, and Ignas Dreyer. Finally, let me just tell everybody there is food and refreshment outside, so let me invite you to come join us, have a conversation with Frank and with the rest of us while we enjoy the food and refreshment. Thank you so much.
Colleagues, can we please stand for the academic proceeding? Thank you.